Welcome, everybody. I wanted to do a quick video. Well, I don't know how quick it's going to be, but regarding the Sky King documentary on Hulu. I watched it this weekend and I wanted to just give some thoughts on it, and I'll explain the relevance of it. I'm sure you all can make the connection as to how you think it's relevant. Basically, Richard Beebo Russell was a 29-year-old ground services worker at the SeaTac airport. He worked for Horizon Airlines, which I believe was owned by Alaska Air or Alaskan Air. Anyway, it was basically about, I believe it was 2018. He showed up to work and he ended up stealing a plane, which was like a bombardier. Let me see if I have the actual type of plane that it was, because it's pretty relevant. So yeah, he was a ground service agent. He stole a Bombardier Dash 8 Q400, which is a twin prop airplane, passenger airplane, from the SeaTac, which is Seattle Tacoma Airport. And he basically was suicidal, essentially, and he took the plane for a joyride and pulled off a maneuver that plane is not supposed to be able to do, which was he pulled off a barrel roll and barely made it, completed the barrel roll. He barely cleared the water, so he was 10 to 20 feet above the water when he leveled back out. It was pretty crazy. If you haven't seen the documentary, I highly recommend it, because the reason why I wanted to address it is because it touches on some recurring and important themes, in my opinion. It addresses the sort of disenchantment of young people at the dissolution of the American dream, I guess. Where you think you're told that if you do this, if you work hard, you'll move up. You get married, you have kids. If you get a college degree, it'll help you get a better job, and so on and so forth. We all know the different narratives that go along with that, the old quote unquote American dream. And he was a guy who, by all accounts, seemed to be a fun loving, maybe kind of a sensitive guy. Whether or not he was able to manage that or not is a big question I think that this documentary raises. And I think that's all the stuff that made this documentary and this person, Richard Beebo Russell, resonate so much with so many people around the world, because it was sort of like this heroic act of defiance and a middle finger to corporate America, because the ground service agents at SeaTac, at least for Horizon, weren't even making minimum wage. At the time, minimum wage was in Washington was $16 an hour, and they were only making like 12 something an hour. And he had gone back to school so he could finish his degree and hopefully move up in the company into a management position, and he was denied that opportunity. And I think that may have been one of the things that precipitated him stealing that plane, because we obviously can't get into his head. He clearly was suffering, or he at least had some mental vulnerabilities that maybe weren't apparent up to that point. but he was making a statement, and he touched on it in the documentary that he, wanted to address that issue, that he wasn't even making minimum wage and that he didn't get an opportunity to move up to management. And, by his supposed, or I guess you could frame it this way, heroic act of defiance, he drew attention to a problem that is more and more apparent. And I think a lot of younger people, I think everybody, but particularly younger people, have to contend with this, is that the world has changed. And a lot of young people, or anybody really who's not wealthy, doesn't have a really high paying job, has faced struggles and limitations based on the changing economy, globalism, and all these mechanisms that are basically stacking the deck against regular people. I can't help but to notice how this whole situation was politicized. And because he did make a statement in his a conversation with air traffic control about, he was talking to one of the air traffic controllers, and he asked him, "How did you get your job?" And the guy said, "Well, I applied online." And I think their conversation touched on, well, you could do anything, you could, move up and do things. And he said, like, "Well, I don't know, I'm a white guy." And that was glommed onto by people, and they tried to spin it like it's a right versus left thing, it's the angry white guy, and so on and so forth. But the documentary does a pretty good job of addressing maybe a more accurate version of Beebo and what he was really going through. So I'm just gonna throw up something right here, and we can discuss it. So the documentary is called Sky King. It's on Hulu and Disney Plus, and that's the a likeness of the plane that he stole and then ultimately crashed into an island, Ketron Island, after he pulled off his barrel roll and he was low on fuel. They had talked to him to try to get him to land the plane safely at a nearby airfield, a military and Air Force base, but he obviously was suicidal. And this is a short presentation here, but we'll go through it, and we can discuss. So it happened in 2018. Richard Beebo Russell, he was 28. I thought he was 29. He stole a Bombardier Q400, and the nickname, one of the I guess the model numbers of that plane was the Dash 8, and apparently pilots called it, uh, their like nickname for it was the Crash 8, because it was a not an easy plane to fly, and it had some quirky things about it. So he stole it from the Seattle Tacoma Airport, SeaTac. He had no formal flight training. He said he played some video games and that he watched some videos and figured out how to get it into the air, but he didn't know how to land it. And ultimately, after he pulled off his barrel roll, he crashed into Ketron Island, which is a small, very, very lightly populated island, which apparently had only like 30 people living on it. And so the documentary shows um, AI representations and dramatizations of his conversation with air traffic control, and they play the actual audio from those conversations. They had interviews with his loved ones and showed some home videos and things. And it addresses mental health and economic pressures, specifically in this case of aviation ground staff, how they're treated, how they're looked at by management and flight crews and things. And it discusses the viral spectacle that this case turned into. And it shows the tragic aspects of it, which I think it did really well. So Sky King, hashtag Sky King and hashtag Beebo forever trended globally. Memes, tributes, and viral clips flooded social media within hours of the incident. Online debates erupted over mental health and economic stress in aviation, yet the internet's fascination obscured a deeply personal tragedy. And like I said, this was sort of politicized. So in this particular case, as the media and social media typically do, they co-opt these stories for their own uses and they frame it how they want to frame it. And the critical reception, it was an empathetic, haunting look behind a viral spectacle. Praised for its use of real air traffic control audio and emotional depth, a powerful blend of tension and sorrow. Noted pacing slowdowns do little to diminish its impact. I'd agree with that. All right, so let's talk about this for a sec. I don't, I like to recommend books and things like that, and I certainly would recommend documentaries. But the reason that I thought that this was a relevant thing to discuss is because, I studied psychology. At one point, I was seriously considering becoming a psychotherapist. I even got into and started graduate school to get my master's in mental health counseling. And I think that, there's a lot of people out there that have vulnerabilities that others may not see. If they're like a fun-loving, funny person, like by all accounts, Beebo Russell was. I mean, he was a football player, he was a wrestler, he went to a junior college to play football in, I believe it was North Dakota, and he just didn't like it. He was very religious, he was a Christian, and I don't apparently, according to the people that really knew him, he didn't like the atmosphere of that party life and being an athlete and things like that. He didn't align it didn't align with his Christian beliefs, apparently. He had also tried to get into the military and pursued a job in law enforcement, but because he was overweight, he got denied those opportunities. He spoke about those frustrations in his conversation with air traffic control. And in my opinion, I'm sure people will have different ways to frame it. It really does a good job of addressing the struggles that people face, both emotionally, psychologically, financially. And he was just a regular guy. He was married with a woman that by all accounts seemed to be soulmates. She seemed to be the love of his life. But I think she came from a very traditional family with traditional gender roles, and he maybe felt that he failed her because he was not able to obtain a high-paying job to help, to be a provider, and I think that is touched on in the documentary, and it's an interesting thing to think about. Um, I have to say, it was a touching documentary because anybody that's had these types of struggles can relate to it. And I think the fact that, he repeatedly stated that he wasn't trying to harm anybody else. They tried to get him to land. They tried to, there were fighter jets following him. Now, of course, my mind goes to the idea, was he shot down? The narrative is that they didn't shoot him down. He crashed into the island. You know, it's another thing we'll never get the truth about, most likely. But there was some weirdness in the transmissions between air traffic control and the fighter pilots that were shadowing him up to that point. Now, he was running out of fuel, so I'm not saying it's not possible that he realized he was running out of fuel. He wasn't going to be able to land it, and he just crashed it. However, one of their intentions, and it's touched on in the documentary, if you pay attention, read between the lines, was to find an area to shoot him down. And one of the things they wanted to do was get him over the water so they could shoot him down. Now, obviously, they weren't going to tell him that because they didn't know if he was dangerous and if he was going to try to crash it into something and harm people. But logically, it would make sense that if a plane was shot down before it crashed, then there wouldn't be as big of an impact with the ground or whatever it crashed into. Again, they showed little snippets of like the fire where the plane supposedly crashed, and you can't see specific debris. So he didn't have a lot of fuel on. So again, this is just my opinion, and you know what? Just to cover myself here, is just my opinion. Is my little disclaimer I'm throwing up over my face. It's just opinions, theories, and perspectives based on research and available information. It's for information, education, and entertainment purposes only. Always do your own research, think critically, and trust your own judgment. We encourage open-minded discussion and respectful dialogue. Anyway, just had to get that out of the way. My mind tends to go to the conspiratorial angle because we've been lied to by the government and the mainstream media so much. It would make logical sense to me that they would have shot him down before he crashed the plane. So that's just something that I thought about. And it wasn't just without anything to base that off of. It was just, there was some weirdness and things that were redacted in the air traffic control conversation with the fighter pilot. So I don't know. You make your own decision on that. I'd like to get your opinions on that, though. I'd like to see what you guys think about that. Well, anyway, to wrap up, I think it's a worthwhile documentary, and there, while it's tragic on one hand, it does raise questions about the vulnerabilities that people face, and maybe particularly young men who may have a more difficult time discussing mental health issues they might be having. And so I would encourage anybody who's struggling with any kind of mental health issues whatsoever to, get help, speak to somebody, because I think people tend to withdraw and go inward when they're struggling, and particularly men. And I think that you feel, or you might feel, that you're alone. You do. I think it's just a natural inclination when you go inward. You feel isolated from others. And it's part, anybody who studied psychology, there's flawed logic that occurs with people's thinking when they're depressed or anxious. And they catastrophize and they think things are worse than they really are, or they feel hopeless. and they don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so they isolate themselves and they don't think that there's a way out, especially when you're young. You don't have as much life experience teaching you that, oh, I got through all these hard times. And you train yourself to know I can get through this. It's going to be hard, but I can get through it. And you learn and you develop tools to help you get through difficult times. And I just think that, it's important to understand that our minds lie to us, especially if we're depressed or anxious or suffering from any mental health issues, that we tend to get in a cyclical thinking pattern. And we don't realize that we can get through it. And if you, just by reaching out to other people, because they may not know what you're going through, they may think you're the happiest guy or girl in the world. They may have no idea that you're struggling, that you're in pain. And so I think that it's important to realize that you're not alone. We're never alone. It's just we have to open ourselves to that we're not disconnected from everything. Yes, sometimes you feel that way, especially in today's world with the divisiveness that's everywhere, shoved down our throats by the media and on social media. That's why, you always hear people say, go out and touch grass. Get out into the world, be around other people. And if you're struggling, get help. I believe in that. I think a good therapist or psychologist or psychiatrist can help, at the very least, get you through that really rough time, get you out of the rut a little bit. And then you learn and you grow, and then your life changes. And, I think everybody should have the opportunity to look back and say, man, remember when I was young, how I thought everything was the end? It was like the be all end all. And it was the most significant thing in the world, that I'd never get through it. But you do get through it. And then you look back and you realize it's just a process. So, anyway, with that, please like and subscribe. And I will be doing, as of now, planning to do a live on Saturday and Sunday. I have a gig on Friday. I'm not going to be able to do a live unless I do a pre-recorded video to release on Friday, which I may do that as well. I'm thinking about doing another one. So anyway, I hope everybody is having a good day. I recommend it. You watch Sky King and give me your thoughts on it, and maybe we can discuss it on an upcoming live. All right, everybody. Thanks and take care. We'll see you soon.